Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Hillary Fairbrother, and I'm part of the team of presenters that will do the presentation today on landing your dream job. Welcome. We are part of the Society for Academic Emergency Medicine's Education Committee, and as such, we are trying to produce quality content from a mix of experts from across the nation within emergency medicine to really facilitate our learners at various stages in navigating the job landscape that is emergency medicine. And I think to say that there's been dynamic changes over the last even 5 years, but longer is probably an understatement. And so we really want to make sure that everyone has valuable information that really might not be something that you're getting out of the didactics of residency conference to really help you land your dream job. Next slide. So again, welcome, and I just want to introduce everyone who's going to be speaking with you today so you kind of know where they're coming from. Our faculty include Connor Dixon, who's both emergency medicine and sports medicine at Santa Clara at Kaiser Permanente in California. Jonathan Brewer, who's both emergency medicine and ultrasound at BUMC, or Baylor University Medical Center in Dallas. Alida Misner, who's emergency medicine from Allegheny General in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Albert Kim from WashU in St. Louis. Aaron Kraut from the University of Wisconsin, and Peter Moffitt from Virginia Commonwealth University, VCU. My name's Hillary Fairbrother. I'm at UT Health Houston, a government med school in Houston. Our objectives today are to really kind of review what the timeline is for deciding a career in emergency medicine. It seems like it's always being pushed up. So what is a realistic timeline for residents looking for a job? And to hopefully help you understand some different job and career options within the really diverse landscape that is emergency medicine. We hope to educate you through quite a variety of emergency physicians who we have available through questions and discussions. As you see, we come from across the country in some very different types of practice settings. In our outline for today, we're going to give you some real resources, so the practical side of things of where and how to look for possible jobs. And then again, really kind of visit that timeline so you're never left not having an opportunity because you were outside of a logistical timeline that leads you to a successful first job. Kind of reviewing some of the options for career and job types, going over some frequently asked questions that we find that a lot of our residents either need to know or maybe not even knowing that they need to ask. And then we'll have a panel discussion where you can ask questions of the faculty. And we also have some questions pre-written to kind of start things off if there aren't a ton of questions from the crew that's here today. And I think that's my last slide. Alida, I hand it to you.
So I'm going to be talking about some places that you can look online to find job opportunities. So the first one is EMRA Job Resources. So if you go directly to EMRA's website, in the top right-hand corner is a link that provides you with different job resources. These are things on how and where to look for jobs, questions to ask in an interview, and also go over the basics of the different kinds of practice. The next resource is the RAMS Roadmap series. So this is put on through SAEM. There are 5 currently that are on the website, which are listed on the left side there. These are to give you a timeline if you're looking for a specific career in any of those 5 aspects. It tells you what you should be doing at each stage of the way and what to expect as you progress from resident to fellow to attending. On the next slide, it shows you just a page of what's in the roadmap. So this basically is telling you what an attending job would look like if you pursued a career in academic emergency medicine. And then on the last page of the roadmap is a list of the different resources that are available. And it has direct links to take you to those websites. And those are websites and resources that would help you build a career and build your CV. The next one is ASAP Career Center. So this one would be open for anybody to look for a job. So they have a job bank called EM Careers, and this is the largest job bank for emergency medicine providers. They also have something on this website called ASAP Open Book, and this is an open forum where any emergency medicine doctor can go online and talk about previous employers they've had So this is a good resource to look at when you find certain jobs or employers that you think you might be interested in applying to. The next page here will show you kind of what it looks like when you go into EM careers. So you can search by different kind of specialties, emergency medicine jobs in general. You can do locations as well as a radius within a specific location. You can also search by employer. So if you want to find a job in a specific area that is heavily populated by a health system, you can go ahead and type in the employer name, a health system, and find job postings specific to those. Next slide. It shows you featured job listings. So these change every week. And these are some of the kind of most prominent jobs that are available right now in emergency medicine. You can also set up on EM Careers a way to get daily or weekly emails, however your preferences, based on certain careers in states, regions. They'll send you an updated list. That way you know as new jobs are posted. The other option is to go directly to the hospital website. So this was one of the job postings that was taken from the EM Careers Job Bank. Oftentimes, even using the job bank, it does not take you directly to the link to apply for the job. So you can search for the health system or the employer, and then on there, go on and find the job that you're looking to apply for. This is also a good resource to use if you know you want to go to a specific area and don't see any job postings. Sometimes they're job posting directly on the website, not posted anywhere else. Other times it'll provide you with the information on who to contact as a physician recruiter to kind of help set you up to look for a job in that area. And then the last one is using John Career Center. So this is open to all of medicine, so you have to search by specialty. There's still a lot of jobs listed on there for emergency medicine, and you can filter it down by location as well. Those are just the links to go to the job research that I just talked about.
Awesome. Thanks, Lena. Hey, everybody. So I'm going to talk for just a couple minutes about the relative timeline. Granted, everybody's situation is going to be a little bit different, but this is sort of a rough look at things from a 30,000-foot view. So if you're a PGY1 or earlier than residency, pre-residency stage, the good news is you can just sort of relax. There's nothing you really need to do to figure out your future job at this point. There are occasionally folks we meet that their only path in emergency medicine is something very specific they've always wanted to do for their entire life. And great, there's no harm in starting to think about what that's going to look like. But for the vast majority of folks, it's overwhelming enough just starting residency and learning how to practice emergency medicine. So that's all you really need to focus on in your PGY1 year. As far as, next steps, maybe late PGY1 to early PGY2 year, folks start thinking about generally like what type of practice environment they might want to enter. And we'll get into a couple more slides about the differences between practice but I think you probably start a little bit earlier if you're pretty set on an academic type job, just because there are some things that you might want to get a head start on in terms of either research or projects or applying for some leadership roles that might help you stand out. But in general, I think your PGY2 year, at least the first part of it, is really devoted to figuring out what types of environments might suit you best. Most of us aren't exposed in medical school to all the different practice environments. So hopefully in your residency, you're getting to rotate at a few different places. You have some exposure to, different faculty members who have different career paths. So you can start to get a sense of that. As Hillary mentioned in the intro, I feel like I've seen over the last 10 years the timeline really start to move up earlier and earlier in terms of when people are applying for and securing jobs. But on the flip side, I also see a resident or two every year that waits until 2 months before graduation and they end up landing amazing job opportunities. So take it all with a grain of salt. You don't need to really freak out right away at the middle part of your second year. But, late part of second year, going into that spring and then summer, people are really starting to get their ducks in a row in terms of getting CVs together, thinking about, cover letters or personal statements, and really honing in with some of the resources Alita mentioned on where they might want to work, kind of sending out feelers or starting to actually apply. And then traditionally the fall of PGY3 year, late summer, early fall is when folks are starting to interview, apply, talk to people, but that spectrum can really be protracted for some folks or really short for others. You can go to the next slide, Connor. So I just want to talk for a couple of minutes about the different types of practice environments. And again, this is not all encompassing and it's relatively broad, but I break it down into really three different categories of spots. You've got your traditional academic hospital referral center, which is places like probably a lot of you are in training or places like many of us work. Then there's your standard community hospital, of which there are many flavors. And these are generally hospitals that might be part of networks of care or big organizations, or they might be small and independent, but they're typically not affiliated directly with medical schools or trainees. And they can be in urban centers, rural centers, they can be really rural, like critical access hospitals, which is a specific designation. And then increasingly, there are these opportunities that I label as hybrid that are kind of parts of each of these different models. So we'll dive into each in turn for a minute. So academic hospitals, referral hospitals, probably the environment all of you are most familiar with. These folks, patients at these hospitals tend to be sicker and more complicated. Speaking from my personal experience here in Madison, we're a big referral center for the region. We get transfers from smaller community hospitals, even from outlying states. People have advanced cancers and have advanced surgical needs. So they just tend to be a bit more complicated, which some folks may like and some folks may not. There's tons of learners at academic hospitals, right? You've got students, medical students, but also nursing students, PA students. There's a lot of folks around. And, if you work in one of these settings in a faculty capacity, you're very often taking on a supervisory and or teaching role. And that generally means you're doing less independent stuff. All those cool procedures and things that you really like doing primarily as a resident, you maybe don't do as much of that. There's also a relative abundance of consultants around, but that also means a number of consultations that you end up calling on most patients. You've got lots of subspecialty services. There's pediatric neurology, there's endocrinology, there's rheumatology, there's hand and plastic surgery. There are all these folks that maybe at other less resource sites you might not have the comfort or the luxury of calling. And then, there are obviously, this can be a double-edged sword, but a lot of these characteristics of academic hospitals, but increasingly we talk a lot about boarding in the emergency department and just general throughput issues. Academic places tend to be busier, more crowded, potentially longer wait times for patients, kind of a more complex system of care to navigate. So that's academic health centers in a nutshell. So contrasting that with community hospitals, again, of which there are a ton of different flavors, but in general, the community hospital practice experience, there's just a lot fewer consultants. And again, that may be something that's really attractive to you for a practice environment and a practice pattern, but it can also be a little bit daunting, if you've got someone who really needs something critical that you haven't practiced doing that much or that you're not that skilled in, and they're nowhere to be found at 2:00 in the morning when somebody really needs that critical procedure. This is a lot more of a do environment versus a supervised environment. So you're generally going to be providing direct patient care. And that goes hand in hand with potentially more emphasis from the emergency department and health system leadership on things like reimbursement and throughput and efficiency, stuff that tends to be emphasized a little bit less in academic hospitals. You're navigating the process of transferring folks a lot of times because you don't have those consultants. So it means phone calls and kind of searching for places for people to go. And then there's the added element of mid-level providers in emergency medicine, which is a whole other can of worms. But generally in the community setting, you are going to be working alongside of and potentially taking some responsibility for the care of patients that are seen by mid-level providers. I want to talk a little bit about the hybrid environment. And I bring this up because in my experience for our graduates from this program, this is a more and more attractive option to a lot of folks. I think as the healthcare marketplace becomes more consolidated, big academic health systems are buying up smaller community hospitals or absorbing them into their network of care. And so it's increasingly possible to find an opportunity where you're an affiliate staff member at a medical school or an academic institution, but you might work 45 minutes from the main academic medical center in a freestanding kind of functional community hospital where it's just mid-levels and attendings and patients. There's not a lot of learners, but potentially 1 or 2 days a week, you get, some rotating senior EM residents or some family medicine residents, or maybe some visiting students from the med school for a month doing a clerkship. So you get the pros of academic health in some ways and the cons of academic health in some ways. You get the pros of community health in some ways and the cons of community practice in some ways. But it can be a nice opportunity for folks who are like, I don't want to be 100% hardcore academic, but I also kind of like teaching and like having learners around. So just know that these opportunities are out there and are becoming increasingly more prevalent.
All right. Well, thanks, Aaron. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of some different practice environments continuing based off of that, and then also a little bit about kind of how do we get paid. So we do want to just mention that there are a couple different payment models. So first off, you've got private equity employers. So essentially, you may have some employers who have more of a financial incentive in terms of these large CMGs that are coming in. We just want to mention that kind of they exist. They are relevant. They've essentially these private equity groups. What they'll do is they'll kind of go around and they'll create these large healthcare conglomerates. And so you have like USACs or US Acute Care Solutions, Team Health, which actually Team Health is incorporated with a lot of other smaller groups as well to kind of create, like, for example, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, we have someone called EMC of Team Health. So that can be a little bit of a misnomer if you're looking for jobs. And then also Envision Healthcare, which is partnered a lot with HCA as well. So a lot of these private equity employers, they own a large group, a large conglomerate of hospitals. So if you go into community practice, you may end up working for one of these. Just know that there may be, as with all different employers, there may be a lot of metrics that need to be met with private equity groups in terms of throughput, in terms of your incentives and things like that. We just want to be aware that these do exist. This can be a 30-minute discussion on the pros and cons of private equity in healthcare. So just kind of want to mention that these do exist. We'll be happy to field any questions about them. All right, and then locum tenens companies. So generally, again, just kind of giving a 10,000-foot overview about these. These are some of the 3 largest locum tenens groups in the United States. I feel like these used to be a lot more popular, and now people are generally signing more so with either kind of these private equity groups, signing with other academic institutions. Locum tenens, essentially, with the way that this used to be, with essentially that you could be in a home base somewhere. You would sign a contract with, say, a rural hospital, and you would fly out, sometimes at the expense of the company. They would put you up somewhere, such as a hotel, and you would work a string of shifts and then come back home. Generally, this can lead to a higher reimbursement rate. I know here in Texas, we have a lot of locum tenens that will do, and that'll send you some very rural areas. The reimbursement can be higher, but also sometimes the risk can be a little bit higher as well. And the resources can be a little bit lower as well with some of these hospitals that are maybe understaffed or that are really just a dire need of healthcare. So just something to kind of be aware with locum tenens companies as well. All right. But this is really the crux of what I wanted to cover today. And this is essentially how we get paid. So in emergency medicine, there are 2 predominant payment models. There's the 1099 model and then also the W-2 model. So with the 1099 model, this essentially means you are an independent contractor. There are pros and cons to each model. Now, with the 1099, generally people think of this as better for taxes. The reason for this is that you are an independent contractor, you are your own company, and you are contracted with a group, right? So you are contracted with a hospital to provide a service, which is emergency medicine. So generally, this leads to higher reimbursement. The downside to this is that it doesn't often come with benefits, and you assume all risk onto your company for the most part. Sometimes there may be an agreement within your contract where, again, there's a malpractice insurance that is provided by the hospital you're at, but generally, for the most part, you may have to cover your own malpractice insurance costs. But the benefit of also being your own company from a tax perspective is that you can write off a lot of the expenses that, say, a W-2 employee can't necessarily do. So 1099 generally does lead to some higher reimbursement, but just remember that, again, you're going to have to pay those taxes throughout the year, just as an employer would. And so generally the way taxes will work for a lot of my colleagues who are 1099 employees is they'll pay taxes quarterly throughout the year for the expenses of their business and the income that business received. Whereas W-2, this is generally what more academic, a lot of community sites will do as well. But this is essentially where you're a full employee of the group. So for example, with my group, I'm a W-2 employee, which means that my taxes are pulled from my salary that I get at my paycheck at the end of the month, right? So my take-home pay occurs after taxes have been pulled, right? The benefit of this also, though, is that benefits are included generally, and oftentimes your malpractices as well. So you're going to see these commonly. I usually do see 1099 more so in the community and W-2 more in the academic settings. All right, next slide. Okay, and then this is something we wanted to touch on as well throughout today. So this is something that you may have heard a lot of discussion from the federal level with terms of banning non-competes. So one thing to keep in mind is there's two clauses that can be written into a contract, and it's really important to know the difference between these. So there's something called the exclusivity clause, which I think of that it applies while you're employed, and the non-compete clause, which applies after your employment. The FTC did come out and ban non-competes, but worded it in a very interesting way that I think is really relevant to know. So what a non-compete is, it essentially prevents the employee from starting a competing business. The whole premise of this was that if you were a high-level executive at a company and you had access to trade data, you couldn't go start a competing business with the trade data of that company after you've left. The FTC's ruling was that anyone that qualifies as a quote senior executive, which I believe the last salary quote that I saw was about $180,000 a year, which is less than what most of us will make coming out of residency. The FTC banned it if you were less than that salary amount. But if you were greater than that, for pre-existing non-competes, they were still in effect. So just something to kind of be in mindful as you're moving forward. Now, generally, if you're coming out of residency, again, this should not apply. But non-competes do essentially what they are meant to do is prevent you from providing a service with your 1099 LLC to a competing interest in the area. And that's why that people banded together and got the FTC to rule against this. What an exclusivity clause is this prevents the employee from getting similar kind of work. So for example, if I'm working at institution A, if I had an exclusivity clause in my contract, I could not go also work for institution B at the same time. So it's really important when you're going through your contract to see if an exclusivity clause is present in there. It's not very common, but it is something that can be in there. So when you're doing contract review, it's just really important to be able to know if it has an exclusivity clause present. And generally, these are both constrained to a regional area within a certain mileage.
In addition, I'll just add to that, Jonathan, that the FCC, the ban on those even things is actually on hold because a federal judge basically overturned it. So now it's waiting for the government to appeal if they are going to appeal or not. So
yeah.
Yeah, the government says that they'll appeal, but I honestly think it's probably going to be which administration is in the White House, whether that continues to be fought out in the courts or whether it just goes away. I'll leave it to you to decide which you think will go each way.
Yeah, and then as we sort of transition over to commonly asked questions, I guess the other part about, I think we should mention about non-competes and exclusivity clauses is, to be honest, like a lot of those concerns that do actually apply to medicine don't really apply to emergency medicine specifically. And so I don't know if you all have had different experiences, but I know at least within academics, like the contract that I signed has a non-compete, but it's really sort of a boilerplate contract for all faculty. So, you know, not just emergency medicine. And I don't know if you all have different experiences, but, you know, it's not really enforced with an EM because it's not really a concern. And I don't know if you all feel differently.
yeah, I mean, the times that I've seen non-competes kind of come up is like this situation where, you know, group A works at one hospital and is employed by mega group 1 or Democratic or whatever. Mega group 2 comes in and buys out, gets the contract, and then group A says you can't have our physicians because they have non-competes unless you pay us for them. And then group B coming in decides, am I going to pay you my like headhunter fee for those people, or do I just scrap all of you and you're all out of jobs and I'm going to bring in all my own new people? And different groups had different mega groups, and different, you know, people buying had different philosophies. Some would just slash and burn, and others would, you know, just bring in tons of locums for, you know, months just to try and restabilize the group, or they would just go ahead and pay off and buy off those things. So I've seen that. The other thing is people always talk about, you know, the same thing is like it might not be as enforceable as it seems. The one thing, I mean, there's certain, I mean, I think I have one in mind. Like I said, I'm in a big academic center, whatever the contract for everyone was. But if mega group, hospital employer, academic facility, or whoever wants to, go to battle with you, the thing to remember is you're footing your own legal bills if you're trying to challenge that. So, but again, negotiating power is sometimes limited. It would be lovely if all of these things went away and they did ban them and we didn't have to worry about them. But even, unless you're at like a small group, probably a lot of these people are going to tell you to go scratch if you try and, tinker with their contract. So.
Yeah, and
I've seen it come into play in the community was when an individual essentially left the group and tried to start their own competing group. So that's when I do see these coming into effect. But just to remember that again, like, if the appeal, so I didn't bring it up because again, there is still contention about it, but if non-competes still stay in existence, the thing to remember then again is that what defines the quote, a senior executive within the language of the non-compete. And if you're going by salary amount, then that would still apply to us.
yeah, and again, I think we're, not to scare folks who are looking at jobs. I guess keeping in mind that the times it does come into play are sort of very specific examples of, I signed, I started with one company, I'm deciding to leave, and it's not that I decided to leave and then just take another EM job somewhere in the region. It's, that's usually not the issue. It's if I'm leaving, but now I'm going to start like a full group that's going to take over an ED or essentially compete with the staffing company itself. And so I think for the vast majority of folks, like that's less of an issue. And then I think Pete's example is, again, if you're signed with a company and that the group staffing that ED gets bought out, like that's kind of a separate issue than you as an individual deciding like, hey, this job isn't working out. I kind of want to look for other opportunities, at least in the region. I can't think of any time where I've really heard of a group being like, oh, you can't leave, or just because, this contract isn't working out, we're going to prevent you from taking your next job within this geographic region. That becomes more of an issue, again, when we're talking about medicine. It's really for like the neurosurgeon who, signs with the university hospital, builds a practice, then decides to leave and go to the community in the same city. Basically, that non-compete is so like, oh, you signed with X university, they help you build your practice, and now you leave and take all of those patients you've established. Like that's really the concern from the employer that isn't really a concern with an EM. They're not concerned that like me as a staffing doc is going to leave, go to a separate hospital, and suddenly take all of those paying patients, right? Like that's not really how EM works. All right, well, next we will roll into some commonly asked questions and some FAQs. And so we'll kind of open it up to the group. If you all have questions on any of our answers or think of additional questions, definitely feel free to throw them in the chat or just turn your mic on and throw them at us. So we'll start with just obtaining your first job. So we'll start with what was the most important factors in choosing a first job. And we'll start with Aaron, who has some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. Thanks, Albert. I think this is obviously very personal and emotional, but for me, I think it was a couple things. Certainly probably the most important for me was just the people and the culture, and not a dissimilar answer probably a lot of folks applying to residency would give. If you're like location can be important, certainly there's lots of other factors, but I've been here now 10 years and I can tell you that coming to work every day and getting to interact with the people that I now supervise, my bosses and mentors, and my colleagues that started about the same time as me, that's the biggest deal. Like having a positive culture, having people that are invested and supportive, I think is huge for long-term career satisfaction. I think the other thing that I'd say, independent of just I wanted to do academic medicine and residency leadership, is just the opportunities that I identified for professional development and then advancement in the organization. Very consciously, this wasn't a place where I was looking at, I need to put in my 15 or 20 years before I get any opportunity to, step into a junior leadership role or, to advance my career. Just the opposite, it was presented to me and came to fruition that if you do the right things, you work hard, there's plenty of opportunity to advance even at young ages. I'd say those are the two most important things for me.
Lovely. And then, John, you have additional thoughts?
I agree with everything Aaron said. I think it's a very personal decision that everyone's going to have different factors that makes that they weigh differently in their own lives. And I think for me, location became a big deal as well in terms of, where my family is. where my wife and I wanted to live. That was a big factor for us. I think another thing as well was the model of practice at the hospital. I knew that I wanted to be in academics, but I also knew that I loved practicing emergency medicine on my own still as well. And so finding a hospital where I could do 30% non-GME and 70% GME, but also work as, within the ultrasound division and work within certain team members that I knew very personally, like Aaron said, being able to go to work each day and just enjoy my team that I'm working with, I think gives just a lot of those factors just weighed equally to me. So I think the overall, the culture of where you practice, the model of it, depending on kind of what you want to do. If you have a niche, do you have the opportunity to pursue that niche? So like mine is regional anesthesia and doing nerve blocks, right? So like having a place that was very supportive of advancing that mission is something that was very important to me when I was looking at different opportunities. And I knew that having a very specific, what I call like sub niche or super niche in emergency medicine, really like an academic center is going to be one of the areas where that's going to be possible, right? I'm going to have the resources to be able to pursue that mission and do research and things like that. So for me, those were all important factors, but I think overall the most important factor for me was my family and where we wanted to be. And we knew we wanted to be back near family. So that's kind of, I think everyone's going to have a different factor that's most important to them. And I think, starting to think about even in your PGY 1 year, just what's important to you, right? What are your priorities in life? I think can go a long way in helping you in the long run.
Yeah, I think that's a great point in making sure that you are focusing on the things that you want in your career, the things that you may want to be your niche within EM, but also making sure that, right, those things outside of your career in clinical practice are important, right? Making sure geography and family, if that is your priority, is equal or not, or maybe even more important than some of those other factors, if that is what's best for your plan moving forward. All right, we'll talk about preparation. So, Pete, we'll start with you on sort of the academic side. So, what types of preparation should a resident consider when planning for an academic job, an academic career?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff out there that people talk about, one of which is, do you need a fellowship to get into an academic job? I'll tell you that I think it really depends on the location, first off. And so some places are looking mostly for fellowship trained people in certain, niches that they can then develop. But other places are kind of just looking for general academic folks. You probably have better luck in systems that you have participated in or let someone in if you're trying to get an academic job without a fellowship. And I think that probably different regions and again, different kind of shops, even academic shops, have slightly different profiles. So I don't think it's not necessary to get a fellowship to go into academics. But I think if you're looking at very specific places, just like anything, if you're looking at a very specific place that you want to be, just check it out, see what kind of their faculty look like, see what the faculty, are they all fellowship trained, find out if that's kind of something for them. As far as during residency, I think, it's easier always to build your portfolio as though you're going into academics and then decide last minute you're not, than it is to go kind of, I'm going to community and then suddenly decide you want to do academics, because you're going to want to demonstrate something in some form of education, teaching, scholarship. So whether that's, helping design a curriculum of some kind and being able to talk about that, whether it's doing, some kind of research, and research or papers and publications don't have to be, go to an IRB, create this whole thing. It can be some case reports and images and things like that. Like people want to see that you can kind of produce some work or generate something educational. Being a chief resident is great. If you can get on there, I think people see that as a sign of like leadership and interest in education. And I think, again, demonstrating you have to be able to tell a story when you go out there that like, hey, I'm interested in teaching and serving and educating. So you can do that multiple ways as a resident, even if it's getting involved in teaching medical students during your, if there's some curriculum that they allow you to participate in, or creating your own. I think those are all options. So just, how are you going to tell people, I want to do academics, I've done something like this before, and here's what it looks like.
Yeah, and I'll address things from the community side. With that said, my entire career has been in academics, but I've done a lot of mentorship for our residents who have gone into the community. And so one thing to keep in mind as you're prepping for a potential community position is just understanding what your employer and what your boss is looking for in an employee. And so for a community job, they may likely care less about your sort of research productivity and how many publications you have, but they want to really know how you are as an employee and sort of the professionalism side of things. They're going to want to know how you perform on administrative tasks. Are you someone that is able to, cross all the T's, dot all the I's, stay on top of their documentation, stay on top of, their license and certifications without having to be reminded? Are you someone who's responsive to email and responsive to, when your boss or leadership reaches out to you? And then the sort of professionalism and patient care side of things, right? Are you someone with good bedside manner? From their standpoint, are you someone who's going to show up, essentially not be a problem, not generate a lot of patient complaints, or, the more severe end, not generate malpractice suits for them, and essentially not be an administrative headache for them? Like, those are the things that as an employer they're going to be looking for. I think sort of additional things that can be a feather in your cap or sort of help you sort of stand out from among the pack are, in general, when I've talked to folks looking for, our residents to hire for community positions, they're looking for folks who, yes, are going to be great in the clinical space, yes, are going to be on top of their administrative tasks, but may also help with hospital leadership and administration. So someone who is able to come in and then sit on the hospital QI committee or sit on some of the TCD committees. So working on the hospital stroke or STEMI committee, and just give EM a bigger footprint within that community hospital or community system, and maybe help offload some of those administrative tasks from their boss or from the person hiring you, is often something that, again, kind of helps you stand out from the rest of applicants. Anyone else have additional thoughts on how to prep? All right, next we can move to finding jobs in locations other than where you are training. So not just in your own geographic region where you're doing your residency training, looking nationwide or maybe internationally. And we can start with Jonathan. We'll send it back to you.
So that's a great question. I think just to give you all a little bit of kind of my background. So I did all my training in Texas. I did undergrad, I did medical school, I did residency in Texas, but I did fellowship in Nashville. And I think one of the biggest benefits of my career was good mentorship and getting introduced to people. So networking. I think the way you find job opportunities in locations other than where you're training is networking. Right. So speak to your attendings, speak to individuals who may have trained in other institutions within your residency program. Right. They're still bound to know people in the area that they can get you in contact with. Networking, we always say that EM is a small world, and it really is. Being able to network, being able to meet people at conferences, being able to discuss people that share the same niches at you, right? So like the reason I'm currently doing this in a hotel room is because I'm at the ultrasound conference right now, and ultrasound's an extremely small world. And so being able to network with certain individuals can really help you out in the long run, even as a resident. So going to the conferences, instead of spending as much as being a former resident, like understanding like what ACEP means as a third year, or being with all of your co-residents for that last draw, spending just a little bit of time, right, meeting other individuals from different areas, right, especially ones that you may be interested in, spending time with people that share the same passions with you in EM. Networking is critical to finding a job, I think, in areas that you haven't trained in. And then also just speaking again to your program director, speaking to other attendings that may have trained in other institutions. I think that can really help you find job opportunities elsewhere. And then the final thing I would say as well is kind of what we had mentioned in the beginning, just doing job searches, right? So SAEM, RAMS, all of these amazing resources that provide different opportunities in different areas and different job postings, right? Just getting your name out there, preparing your CV and sending that out, I think can really help you out.
All right, Pete, additional thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so much of it, like you said, is networking, but I also think people forget to ask, right? So like, I mean, I can't tell you the number of residents of mine that are out there. They're like, oh yeah, I was trying to get this job at so-and-so. And like, yeah, I know a graduate of ours from 5 years ago that's there. Why didn't you ask? Like, oh, oops. So like I say alumni networks, but really, I mean, that's plugging into like the faculty you already have and, your program leadership and being like, hey, I'm kind of looking in this region, or these are some places, or do you have any ideas of kind of X? And then like, oh yeah, I know 4 people at this place, 3 here, someone over there, and you just never know, who someone knows. I think too, like if you're really not sure and you're looking just kind of regionally, if you kind of look at some of the hospitals you like, and if they're all under the same group, that's why they have like recruiters and stuff. So if you're like, okay, fine, I don't care, I want to go to this area, like there's USACs, just talk to the recruiter. They'll tell you exactly what jobs are out there and exactly where to go. And so I think that's another thing. And then the other piece I think is just to kind of remind people or to think about is you have established networks without thinking about it. Sometimes I think sometimes our networks we forget about. So, as a medical student, you hopped around with all these people. Maybe it was one of your colleagues, and you can be like, hey, where have you been in your last, year or so? And I'm looking at this region. Do you know anyone there? And you'd be surprised how many people, it's just word of mouth that you find a job or something. So create those opportunities for yourself.
The only other thing I would add too is if you guys do go to ASEP during your residency, they do have a massive job fair as well that they will section off by region, and you can speak to. I love what Pete said about talking to recruiters. They will have recruiters there that can get you connected with resources for jobs in that area. And so one of the things I did before we did this presentation today was I spoke to one of my best friends who's a medical director in a community position. And unfortunately, he was unable to make the panel today. But one thing he really said was to, again, just like Pete said, speaking to your mentors, speaking to different recruiters, because they can get you in touch with these medical directors who that you can then speak to a little bit more about what the job is like in that area.
Yeah, and then we'll take a little detour. William left a comment in the chat about how many either jobs or fellowships should one apply to. I think I'll field fellowships first, and I think unfortunately the answer is it's going to be very fellowship dependent and very much dependent on sort of other factors, since each fellowship is going to be very specific in sort of how competitive or how popular it is. And then again, sort of what are those other factors? Not just, oh, I want to do an ultrasound or an EMS fellowship, but are there other factors that, I want to be in the Northeast or actually want this specific type of experience in my fellowship? So these are the 3 or 4 places that will give me that. I think it's going to be a very kind of nuanced answer depending on some of those other factors. So I think it's kind of hard to leave a generalization. But for anyone have any thoughts about sort of actual sort of faculty spots then?
So I'll say one other thing about fellowships, just to add a tone of optimism and hopefulness. Compared to like applying to med school or residency, most fellowships in emergency medicine are not really competitive globally. Like there are plenty more fellowship spots available than people who want to do them. Now, if you say, I must be in this one city for this one specific fellowship, any of those things can get competitive, right? A lot of fellowships in EM only have a couple spots available. And so if there are 3 people nationally who all want to be in Denver for EMS and they only have a couple spots, like that could get really competitive. But in general, you'll usually be able to find a fellowship spot if that's kind of your calling and that's what you want to do. So less stressful than the earlier stuff. As far as faculty jobs and how many to apply to. I think academics is very different than other types of practice in terms of competitiveness. I'll use our own experience here at my institution. This is really cyclical, and I think it depends on a lot of factors. There are many years where we have a job opening for the whole academic year, like one. And there are other times where, for example, we built out this kind of hybrid site. Our volumes are growing by 25% a year, which is, one of the fastest growing emergency departments in the United States. And we just need people to staff it. We keep adding shifts. There's more opportunities. And, the last few years, we've hired 5 or 6 faculty a year. So it really just depends. I think especially for academics, it's not always, people aren't always going to just post jobs and say, this is what's available. I think that's more a game of, I kind of want to be here, like, let me put out some feelers and express my interests. And it's more of an individual back and forth with potential employers, as opposed to, you can't unfortunately just open a SAEM newsletter and be like, oh, here are all the available jobs. Community, I guess, is a little bit different, but other people have thoughts?
No, just the factors going into it. If you have to be in a region, a spot, or whatever, then you're going to over apply like anything. I saw someone that was like, I absolutely 100% need to be in, it was it was here at Richmond, right? They actually said, if I can't get this fellowship, I will go to this fellowship. Like it was like, I'm interested in 2 to 3 things. I don't even care. I have to be here. I need to do this for X, Y, and Z. And so I saw someone else that was like, I want to be in Richmond eventually. Let me go off and do a fellowship. And then, came back and worked somewhere else, not even used their fellowship because there were no spots open at our spot, right, at the time. And so they plugged in the community, loved it, stayed. So, it worked out for them. But like, so those kind of situations pop up too. You have to think about your situation.
And Pete, we're gonna go a little out of order since we're kind of short on time. And
Oh, yeah.
keep you on the mic because I think it's important to address what situations does public loan forgiveness apply? I think it's good that we address
Yeah.
that.
So the thing is, first off, you can do lots of Googling. I should just paste it in I have it actually pulled up here, so I'll put this in here too. I like the White Coat Investor, generally good financial advice for physicians. And this is a great post that gives you a ton of information on it. But generally, what you have to remember is it's the direct federal loans that are eligible for this. You have to be employed full time, typically by a nonprofit, 501c3, or a governmental employer. And so, like the VA is one, right? Like, for example, here at VCU, we count. And so our residents can participate in this. Payments have to be made through a specific program, and there's a ton of them. So you can see if you go to that website. And then the other thing is, one of the things that gets people is not filling out the form correctly or getting the form filled out. I know that sounds silly, but it's amazing. If you go to work at a big institution, people are like, oh, I don't know, this is due in like 4 days. Like they suddenly discover this form 4 days before it's due, and then they can't find the person that's to sign it. It's a mad rush, right? So a lot of times, yeah, as someone pointed out, a lot of academic centers kind of count towards this, but it's finding out who can get that form stamped for you and filled out correctly. And so, again, you can kind of look at it, see what kind of framing programs are out there. But I think you will actually be surprised sometimes at what institutions do count. So if you're dead set on an institution, find out if there's a way to make it work for you.
And then Connor, you had some additional thoughts?
Yeah, so recently there were a couple of, I don't know who lobbied for it, but there was a bunch of lobbying within both California and Texas, and they both have very similar language in some of their state laws that truly prohibit physicians from like owning or working as part of the business of hospitals to kind of separate the financial incentive into patient care, which is all well and good, but it essentially, unless you are working at a government hospital, usually a state-run hospital, one of the like University of blank hospitals, or if you're working for one of the other academic centers, which typically then you're employed by like the university and not the hospital system, which they're two separate things typically, then you're basically prohibited from being able to file under PSLF. I don't really know why all the other states are different, but with California and Texas in particular, there have been exemptions that are allowed where instead of the employer that's on your paycheck, which is sort of the big kind of sticking point of a lot of this, is that a lot of people say, hey, I work at this hospital. That hospital's nonprofit. Why am I not qualifying for this? And that's because your staffing group or the person that actually pays you your paycheck is a for-profit institution. And this is where a lot of the CMGs and the private equity will come into play. But even most just normal staffing groups, non-CMGs, or even Democratic groups, they're technically all for profit for the most part. And if that is the corporation or the company that's paying your paycheck, you technically do not qualify for the PSLF as a nonprofit like employee. But for California and Texas, they've made exemptions where instead of it being the person on your paycheck or the company in your paycheck, as long as you are primarily, there's a certain percentage of time that you have to qualify for, primarily working at a nonprofit institution, meaning like the hospital itself or, like the healthcare organization, they are then allowed to actually sign off on your PSLF application as essentially your employer. So for a case in point, I work at Kaiser Permanente, which is obviously larger on the West Coast and in California, and I'm in California. And so our physician group is technically called the Permanente Medical Group, and that is a for-profit physician group. So they are paying my paycheck in as a for-profit group. But Kaiser Foundation Hospitals, or KFH, is who owns, that's like the insurance company side, the insurance of Kaiser Permanente, and they also run all the hospitals. They are nonprofit. And so recently, it was about a year ago that this happened, or a little over, they ruled that. And so I actually got it approved through PSLF that KFH signed off, like the hospital signed off on my PSLF application. So I'm technically qualifying that while still getting a paycheck from a for-profit institution.
And then We're down to the last couple minutes, but we'll address this last question. What regrets over the first job? John, had some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so in terms of do I have any regrets about the first job I had? I do not. I finished fellowship and my wife and I, even though our family was in Dallas, we loved Nashville. I loved where I was working. The cool thing about a lot of EM fellowships is you actually get to work as an attending because you are a board eligible physician while being a fellow as well. And so I love the institution that I was at. So we actually stayed in another year in Nashville with the intention that it was going to be a five-year plan. So I kind of had two first jobs in a sense because we then had a son and decided it was time to move back home for family. So I was there for about a year. Now, most young EM physicians, and I was talking to my friend who's a medical director, will really be at their first job for less than 2 years. So it's very common for them to make a quick transition. So there is some good advice that I'll leave Albert for you to kind of talk about. But I think in terms of regrets about your first job, I do not. I think one of the things that I really loved about it, again, was the culture of the institution I worked at. And I love the culture of the new institution that I've been at now for 3 months. But I think the things that you can do if you don't like it, the nice thing about emergency medicine is, again, we're not trying to take $1 million practice with us, right? And so this is a very flexible career. We have the opportunity to make that transition from academics to community. A little bit more difficult to go from community back to academics, but we do have that flexibility in our lives. We have the flexibility to be a nocturnist, right? Whatever's most conducive to what our passions are, right? And the cool thing about being an attending is that you can really start to explore those passions outside of medicine as well. And so I think, in terms of regrets about my first job and my second, I absolutely do not have any regrets. I think that, but I do appreciate that in our career, we have the flexibility that we can change if life circumstances change.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that is knowing that a lot of folks will change positions within the first 2 years. There's a lot of bits of advice, but I think the big one is just also don't lock yourself into multi-year contracts, right? Like there is sort of this, myth of like, oh, like coming out of residency, oh, it's nice to have guaranteed employment for 3 to 4 years. The flip side is, well, if I do want to move, if my life circumstances change or I don't like this job or it's not what it turned out, like it's not turning out the way I expected, you also don't want to be locked into some place that you're really not enjoying. And there's usually a reason places are trying to lock you in long term. So leave yourself that flexibility.
Yeah.
All right, I think we are actually out of time. So anyone with any last bits of advice for our soon-to-be EM physicians?
The one thing I would say on that last question too is beware of large signing bonuses because they can entice you as a third-year resident coming out, but there's a reason they're probably offering a very large signing bonus for that job, just like Albert was saying about multi-year contracts.
All right, Connor and Hillary, we'll turn things back over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Thanks to all of our panelists and faculty who are on here, and thank you for everybody who joined. So just kind of the summary here, consider your timeline and the variety of practice types and employment models. You can have a lot of variety in the geographic locations and the types of jobs, the types of payment models. And then there are many, many, many resources that you can use to both find jobs or just learn about the process in general. And in general as well, just kind of reaching out to your personal contacts wherever you're in residency and doing your training. Everybody will have many, many networking opportunities and ways that you can look for jobs and careers. For those who are interested, our specific section of the SAEM Education Committee will have 2 additional webinars later on, I guess early next year in 2025. So we're going to have one in February, and it's going to be more geared towards medical students and how to successfully apply to EM residencies. And then in April, we're going to have sort of the reality of the emergency medicine career, both the positives, the negatives, sort of talking about all of the things that people may not talk about frequently or may try to hide, just so that you can be fully aware of what you're getting yourself into and make sure that it's actually what you want. But thank you, everybody, for joining, and we hope you have a good rest of your week.